Hello guys, how many times did you mess up in the opening? I guess the number is huge, right? Because you don't understand which opening should you play. So in this video, I am going to share with you which openings should you play based on your rating. So if you are rated 600 to 1000, you should play a defensive game like the Italian game or the Royal Pace as white, because the beginners are quite afraid to attack their opponent, because if you attack you might have to sacrifice your pieces, and if you don't sacrifice correctly you will be inevitable. So I recommend to play a defensive game if you are a beginner. So we start with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop c4. It is quite a defensive game because you ultimately will play d3, bishop e3, knight c3 and a short castle. This is a very common opening for white to play a defensive or a drawish kind of a game. But as black uh, or the royal pace, if you want to play the royal pace, you have to play knight c3, pawn d3, bishop e3 and then short castle. The ideas are same. Another one, another opening that is defensive is the four knights game by knight c3 and then knight f6. Then you can play probably g3, then bishop g2 and then short castle, short, short castles. So that goes white. Now if you are black, then after bishop c4, the Italian game, I don't recommend knight f6 because then you would probably get knight g5, which is the Friedel attack. So if you play this, you might see this move attacking on f7, and it is highly unlikely that you will feel uncomfortable as a beginner in this position. The main move in this position is d5 here to block this bishop and attack. So this is the main line, but I recommend bishop c5 because it is called the Traxler, because it ultimately is a very attacking game for black. But I don't recommend this for a beginner player. That's why I think you should not play f6, knight f6 if you are a beginner. You should probably play a6, because now then you can play knight f6, because now there's no knight g5. So this was the Italian game. And now if bishop b5, which is the Spanish game, you should probably play the Berlin defense here, which is the favorite opening against the Royal Pace of me. Then you can play bishop c5 and then short castle. If you face the four knights game here, then if white plays bishop c4 here, you can take, because knight can't. If knight takes, then d5 forks. So ultimately you will be here, and as you can see, it is there is an advantage for black. You uh, you have the bishop pair, which white don't have, and white also have a advantage because he can play knight c3 again to attack our queen, and then queen has to move, so he will get a tempo here. So this is the defensive game that I recommend for a beginner. So let's talk about the intermediate level players who are rated to 1000 to 1500. So if you are rated to 1000 to 1500 rated player, you should probably play defensive and attacking games, because if you play attacking games you will grow experiences for yourself. And talking about time, a beginner should play the rapid and the classical games, because you need to think the moves that you want to play. And if you are an intermediate level player, you should play rapid and blitz games. And if you are rated up to 1800, then you should play bullet games, bullet and blitz. So going to the main theme, if you are an intermediate player, you should play attacking and defensive games like e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Then if Italian, you can play knight f6 now because you are an intermediate level player, and if the fried liver attack happens, you will not play d5 even though it is the main move, because if you play d5 then pawn takes d5 and there is knight a5 here to attack this bishop, but highly unlikely. I don't want this position as black. I don't like it, you can say. And don't take this pawn. Obviously it is a huge mistake, because then you will face the fried liver with knight takes f7, then king takes and then check, and your opponent will crush you with the fried liver attack. So you should not take on a d5. You should play knight a5 if you play d5 in this position. So in this position I recommend for the intermediate level players to play bishop c5, inviting white to take on f7. There are a lot of different variations. If you play the traxler counter attack, then knight takes f7, bishop takes f2 check. I will cover the traxler counter attack soon on a video. So if your opponent goes for the fried liver attack, you can counter that by playing the traxler counter attack. This is my most favorite opening as black. Actually, I have won up to 95% of my games if I play the traxler. Yeah. So then if you face the real pairs, you should play the defensive game with Berlin defense, or maybe the a6 move to attack the bishop. So what if, going back to the beginner, what if black plays the queen's pawn opening, white plays the queen's pawn opening, sorry, with d4. Here as black, you should play the Indian game here as as black. So after, or you can play d5 as well. As beginner, you should play the d5 move, because the d5 move is a very defensive game. If Queen's Gambit, you should probably decline the Gambit by Queen's Gambit decline variation or the slab defense. Two are most common moves. You can play knight f6 also to defend this pawn, but you should not play the Albion counter gambit with e5 here as beginner. But talking about the intermediate level players, if you see the queen's pawn opening and you decide to play the d5 move, and if you face the queen's gambit, you can play the Albion counter gambit here with the move e5, counter attacking this pawn. So if c takes d5, then you can take on d5 with your queen, and if pawn takes, then you can trade off the queens and then play the knight c6 to attack this pawn. So also you can play defensively with e5, e6 or d6, sorry, c6. So this was the point of playing d5. As beginner, you should not play the Indian game with knight f6, but you can play that as well. But the talking about the intermediate level players, you should play the Indian game. If I face a d5 d4 in this position, I most likely go for knight f6. So there are a lot of variations. White's main idea would be to play c4, knight to c3, and then e4. So with the help of this knight here. So if you face c4, there are a lot of ways to play this. The e6 move, this is the main move in this position, and if your opponent sticks with his plan, you can pin this knight with bishop b4, which is the Nimzo Indian defense here. So here white can't play e4 because you will take the pawn, because this knight can't take because of this pin. So it is the Nimzo Indian defense, you can try. Also, if your opponent has seen the Nimzo Indian defense, then he can try the anti-Nimzo Indian defense with the move knight f3. Here you can play bishop b6, then bishop to b7, then play maybe play c6 first, then play d5. Here, if the knight comes to c3, you most likely pin this knight to the king, and if you face a3, then you should take the knight, because it defends the crucial e4 square. So this is the Queen's Indian defense here, and you can play the Grunfeld defense too. Sorry, after the move, this is the Benoni defense, and so after c4 here, you can also play the Budapest Gambit. The Budapest Gambit is my favorite opening, as if I face the move c4 here. After the Budapest Gambit, there are two ways to play as white. the advanced variation and the exchange variation. If he takes, we can play knight to g4 or knight to e4. These two, this is the Buddha's Gambit main line. And if you play knight e4, this is the firewitch variation of the Budapest Gambit. And if he advances, you can play bishop c5. And here's a trap for white. If your opponent plays bishop to g5 here, then it's a big mistake, because you can then play knight to e4. And like Erik Rosen, you say, oh no, my queen. And if bishop takes queen, then bishop takes f2 is a checkmate. And here white is in trouble, because he have to save the bishop and also stop the mate. So the only way for white is to play bishop e3. Then we can takes, and then check, only move, knight takes. If takes, then we can take the rook. And if he does not take, like plays a natural move like this, we can play this move, and that's a mate here with the queen. And what if he plays this move in this position? This move in this position. You can then slide your queen to this h6 square, maintaining this pin, and then play this move or this move. If this move, rook to g1, then you can play this move and black's king is exposed, and also we are up a pawn here. So this was the main line here. If your opponent plays g5 in this position. So if it takes, then the Budapest Gambit has the many different lines. I will cover them in a separate video. So another defense against the queen's pawn opening in this position after c4, you can play the king's Indian defense by e6 here. If white plays knight c3, preparing for this move, e4, we can play bishop g7, e4, then short castle. Even though it looks like it is completely winning for white, because he has the center control here, but black has some advantage here. You can play d6 and then e5 to break the center. Also you can play e6, c6, and then d5 here. Also you can play b6, then bishop b7, then play c6, e6, then d5, then knight to d7. So it's a very defensive game as black. And white would play e3, then d3, bishop e3 and d3, then knight e2, then queen to c2, and then play this move, e5. So this is a very common opening as black against the queen's pawn opening. As black, you should not play the Grunfeld defense, because it is very complicated opening. It is like the Traxler counter attack, but not that complicated. But it is still very complicated opening, the Grunfeld defense. So you should not try that as a beginner or intermediate level player. You should try the Queen's Indian or the Nimzo Indian or the Budapest Gambit. Budapest Gambit is also the main move in this position, and also the King's Indian defense. So this was the Queen's Pawn opening game. So as white, if you play the Queen's Pawn opening and your opponent plays Indian defense, you can play the London system here with the move f4, bishop f4. The idea would be to play knight f3, knight to play c3, play knight to d2, and then play knight to b3. Maybe you can push these pawns forward to attack the queen side, and you should probably castle on the king side here by playing g3, bishop g2, knight f3, and then castles. Or if your opponent plays the King's Indian defense, again, if you don't play the London system here, the King's Indian defense, you should not castle the king side. You can play an attacking game here by playing h4, g4, h5, then h6 here. And you should probably put your king in the center and play bishop d3 and bishop e3 here, and knight d2. Also you can play knight to e4 after playing d2, and then play this move after black castle. This is a preparational setup for white, so it is a defensive game as well, attacking as well as defending. So if you face the Retis opening here, you should probably play d5, knight c6, bishop to g7 after pushing g6, then play a knight to f6, and then short castle. As black, the more defensive way to play, if your opponent plays e4, is to play the modern defense with the move g6. By playing this, you are preparing for bishop g7, then play pawn e6, knight c6, pawn d5, bishop c7, and then knight to e7. In most cases, if you play the modern defense here, you should not put the knight to f6 because it will block your bishop from getting shot in the center, in the open diagonal. So you should play knight to e7 rather than playing knight to f6, and then short castle. And if you are playing as white, and if you see the pawn move, if you want to play a defensive game where your opponent fianchettos the bishop, you should fianchetto the same way as your opponent, and where you fianchetto your bishop, that way you should castle. If you fianchetto through this side, queen side, you should probably castle queen side here. But if it is if your opponent first fianchettos the pawn, their bishop, you should not play the opposite way, because if you play this, bishop will cover this first, this diagonal first. So you can't play bishop b2. You have to play c3, and then bishop b2 will not work because you block this bishop, and the bishop can't do much here. But black's bishop is very active along this diagonal. If you push the pawn accidentally, you will lose your rook here. So be careful not to fianchetto the opposite way of your opponent. So you should fianchetto the same way as your opponent. If your opponent fianchettos their bishop to queen side, you should fianchetto your bishop to queen side. And if your opponent fianchettos their bishop to king side, you should fianchetto through the king side. So after g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, then probably knight f6. You will not play knight f3, you will play knight e2 here. Sorry, knight f3, knight f6, knight e2, then short castle here, castle, and it is a very control game. So that was the defensive game as black and as white. But if you are an intermediate level player and if you want to attack after e4, e5, you can play the king's gambit or the Danish gambit here. I mean, the d4 takes, c3 takes, bishop c4 takes, and bishop b2. The idea of Danish gambit is that you sacrifice 2 pawns, but you keep an eye on the king side here with 2 bishops, and you should not trade the bishops or the minor pieces that you have or the queen, because they are very powerful in such a open game. And if the center game is declined here with the move d6 or f6, f6 is a blunder because you can take. If takes, then check. If g6, then sorry, there's a fork. And if king to e7, then takes. King's got only one move, then check, and it's very unpleasant for black actually. Here check, and then if king g7 here, then it's actually mate in 1. Can you find it? If you find it, tell me in the comments. I would leave this for you. So if takes, then here bishop c4 check. If this move, then takes. And the only way for black to avoid the checkmate is to sacrifice his queen. And then takes, and is very unpleasant for black. So this was the and if your opponent plays d6 in this position, you can take. If takes, you can trade, and black's king is stuck in the middle. He can castle. You can play knight f3, bishop c4, knight c3, or even knight to d2, bishop g5, and then castle, or maybe castle queen side, because you need the open file for the rook. So maybe in this position you should castle long, not the short, and before playing bishop g5 you should play bishop pawn f4, then knight f3, then bishop takes f4 with the eye on the c7 square. So here the Danish Gambit, and if you want to play the King's Gambit here, I will make a video on it soon, as it is my favorite opening as white. So after takes you can play a knight f3, bishop c4. There are lots of fashion as the King's Gambit. Of the King's Gambit, you can play d3, bishop takes f4, and then castle. And you should probably castle short here, because ultimately you want the rook to come to f1 square to join the short of the of the king side. And if you play the h4 move here, I will show the lines on that video. Stay tuned. Then you should probably castle short, long. So this is the, and if your opponent plays the Scandinavian defense against you, you can take, don't saying he will play the Dagban Klusterborg Gambit. Then you can accept the gambit, and then if you accept the gambit, then you have to rapid development, because if you lazily develop your pieces, you can be attacked. So develop pieces rapidly with knight f3, bishop c4, and then castles. Don't develop pieces in the queen side, and in the play first develop the king side pieces and then castle, then play knight c3, then pawn d6, d3, sorry, and bishop f4. Don't fianchetto in gambits. So talking about the Danish Gambit as black, if your opponent plays the Danish Gambit against you, after takes, if you face the c3 move, don't saying if it takes our pawn, which is the center game, you should not accept the gambit because it would be very dangerous. You should play the Capablanca defense with the move d5. So then there are the pawn takes d4, pawn takes e4, knight c6, knight f6, bishop to d6, then maybe queen to e7, and maybe put the bishops on these squares and put the knights on this square, because you can't play this move because of this pawn. You can't play this move because ultimately if it takes, it controls this square. So that was the point of, if your opponent plays d4 in this position, and if you face the Danish Gambit, don't decline the center game. You can decline the center game by playing knight c6 to defend, but it would be a target because after pawn d5 you have to move the knight again, which is not a quite good move. So I recommend to take. So another one to be played after e4, you can play the Sicilian by playing the move c5 here. then you can play knight to c6, and the best defensive way to play the Sicilian defense as black is to play the g6 and bishop g7, the dragon Sicilian. Then play knight to g6 or knight to e2, e7, then short castle. Play this move, or maybe even this after play d6, maybe fianchet to both sides. You should not fianchet to both sides in some openings, but in this opening, the dragon Sicilian, you can fianchet to both sides, because the this file, this diagonal and this diagonal would be opened for a bishop. So play b6, bishop b7, and then target this diagonal. So after, and if you are playing as white, after Sicilian, you can play the Alpine defense by playing c3, or maybe the knight c3 move also works, and may play g3, which is a close Sicilian defense, close Sicilian. The ideas are same. You have to castle kingside, develop kingside rapidly, put your pawns in the center. After playing I prefer c3, because after c3 you can play d4 in this position. But if you play knight to c3 here, you can't play this move, because if you play this, then takes, queen takes, and first of all your queen will be targeted by playing the move knight c6. It hampers your development, and also black would be have this open diagonal, and also he has extra pawn, extra center pawns. He has two central pawns, but you have only one. So I recommend to play the Alpine defense here, because if you play d4 and take, you can take with the pawn, and after knight c6, there's no threats on the pawn because it is defended. But as the intermediate little player, you can play a gambit here by playing the move b4. This is the wing gambit here. After takes, you can play s3, takes, and then bishop takes. The idea is to play rook to b1 after moving the knight, and then enjoy the open file. So here, if you face the French defense, you have to put your pawns, play g3, bishop to g2, then castle after playing knight f3. So the ideas are same as the defensive and the attacking. So this is all today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you successfully win a game with a defensive game, then you can share the link in the comment section. Like this video and subscribe. See you guys in the next video.